Hey there, hunting fans! Spencer Rimple, the Moose Whisperer, bringing you exciting hunting and outdoor adventure stories from around the world. Today's story is a death-defying encounter and comes to us from Chuck LaFortune, an accomplished elk hunter from the northern Rocky Mountains, right on the border of British Columbia and Alberta, Canada. All right, stick around till after the story to hear more about today's author. So as always, let's get right to it. The year was 1984. I would have been in my mid-30s, living on a ranch with my wife and 2 kids. In those days, hunting was a huge part of my life and our diet. I was lucky enough to have a friend named Ross, who was just as enthusiastic about hunting as myself, perhaps even more. In fact, if you're from the Elk Valley, he's quite a local legend around there. A hunter's hunter, and one of the toughest guys I've ever hiked with. We've been great friends and outdoor adventurers since we were 9 years old. Ross was single and living up in Elkford, the furthest town up the Elk Valley, and just by the name of the area and the town, you know you're in the right place for hunting elk. In fact, when the season is closed in the spring and summer, people often have to chase them off the golf course before they can get to the 9th hole. The road up into this valley and the town itself exists basically because of the new coal mines that are in these mountains. The town itself had only been created just 10 years earlier. Now this is truly wild country. Each mine site had a resident elk herd that has learned the safe zones and all the no hunting areas. Often each mine site would be swapping pictures to see who had the biggest bull elk. This is all nestled high in the Rocky Mountains, the town itself being at an elevation of 1,300 meters or 4,300 feet. Now, since Ross was living there, he would spend a lot of time scouting, and I would meet him, bringing my 2 horses along, aiding in getting us up into the backcountry. But this hunt was right at the end of elk season, in November, with plenty of cold and snow. So this time I left the horses at home as we decided to hike for it. We were way up the fording river where Ross's friend had a trapper's cabin that we would use for our launch point, staying 3 or maybe 4 nights. So now we're even higher into the mountains. And as you can imagine, at that elevation of say 6,000 feet in November, at the north end of the Rocky Mountains, it was cold. Damn cold. But we were tough, young, filled with courage, tenacity, and sometimes a little tequila. We figured we were invincible. Our first morning, we woke up to 6 inches of fresh snow on a base of 2 feet already. Hiking would be tough, but we'd certainly be able to track them. I glanced at the thermometer that was nailed to the side of the cabin, and it said minus 20 degrees Celsius, or minus 4 degrees Fahrenheit. And that's without the wind chill factor. I dressed warm, and we started our ascent in the pitch black, hoping to arrive at the plateau right at first light. It would be another 2,000-foot elevation gain, just to get to the tree line. Moving up, the temperature never gets warmer, and as we hiked hard through the bush and snow, our exertion keeping our bodies warm, it was easy to forget about the dangerous cold. We arrived at the plateau just when we planned, encouraged to see fresh elk sign everywhere. As we studied the tracks, moving more slowly, we started to feel that the temperature had dropped perhaps another 5 degrees. With a slight wind, we must have easily been looking at minus 30 degrees Celsius or minus 22 degrees Fahrenheit. Now, a funny thing was that Ross and I had both just bought brand new hunting rifles, the Browning Bar semi-automatic. And our only real concern at that moment was that the action on those rifles would not reload properly in the cold weather. Mine was chambered in 7mm Magnum and his in 30-06. We had them clean and oiled up, but with the blowing snow all around, there was still a chance the action could ice up. So we made a plan. We had a strategy that if and when we seen a legal bull, which would be a 6 point or greater, we would both line up and fire one after the other, so the second shot would be a quick follow-up bullet into the elk. We followed the tracks a bit further, and as you know, that late in the year, there's no more bugling. These elk are basically held up high, keeping safe from the hunters. As the season ends, they will start to move down to where there is much better feed. At this elevation on the plateau, we were already at snow above our knees, which is tough going for the elk. They have to paw and plow through so much snow just to get a mouthful of grass. We kept tracking, moving slow. This time of the year, the elk are generally very skittish, having been chased around by hunters and hearing shots for the past 2 months. These elk are definitely up here hiding, thinking no person is crazy enough to come up here. We got lucky and we came across them. There was a bit of a hollow at the top of the ridge and then a long run going up. Honestly, it looked like a natural amphitheater, maybe 500 or 600 yards across. They were at one end and we were at the other, too far for a shot. And I think they had sensed us, for they were starting to move up and not ambling along. They were moving like they were leaving. So we figured, okay, our only chance is to get across and then up that ridge, because when they crest that amphitheater, it was even more steep beyond that, and we would never be able to chase them after that. If they got the jump on us, we would never get close enough for a shot. Basically, our idea was to cut around and then move up one side without being seen and meet them at the top. We had a bit of cover, but we still had to be stealthy. And just as important, we had to be fast. So we were running. And if you know Ross at all, like most people do in that area, he was an animal. The guy could go and go and go. Nothing could stop this guy, and I was hot on his tail. My lungs gasping for air, my legs in pain, and my heart filled with respect for the endurance of my friend and pride for myself that I was keeping up to this famous hunter. Gasping for air at that elevation, I thought to myself, there's no way I can make a shot in this condition. As we crested the top of that ridge, to our delight, the herd of elk was about 200 yards away, as they never even suspected that we were coming up there after them. Deep breath, deep breath. Calm down. Get your breathing under control. With a small, scraggly alpine tree as a rest, I held my sights on a 6x6 bull. Ross fired first, and there was no reason for me to shoot. No reason for a follow-up shot, as that elk went straight down. We celebrated, cheering and excited, waiting for the appropriate time to pass before we approached him. The adrenaline that was coursing through our veins now dissipating, the excitement of the chase now fading as reality started to sink in. It was brutally cold as we approached that elk, and we were really starting to feel it. A worry for our safety was in my mind. But being the hunters, the meat hunters we were, the thought of just leaving with only the antlers never entered my head. We started gutting that elk, but even with gloves, the cold had frozen our hands and holding a knife was becoming very difficult. As the shakes of hypothermia started setting in, my worry increased. We had our pack boards with us, and our typical hunt would be to skin and flesh it all out, strapping hundreds of pounds of meat to our boards before heading down. To cut up all that meat and fashion it to our boards is a time-consuming process. And that was time I was starting to suspect we didn't have. I was a skier as well, and had spent lots of time in the Rocky Mountains skiing down the steepest of slopes. Speaking of steep slopes, we were right beside an avalanche chute that went pretty much right to the bottom of the plateau, where the cabin was close to. I got to thinking, maybe if we sit on that elk like a toboggan, holding its horns back so they don't dig in, we might just be able to ride that sucker all the way down. Well, Ross thought that was a great idea and was willing to give it a try. But first, we had to finish gutting this big elk. By now, we were aware of the danger and thinking that we had pushed it too far, and there was a good chance of our own demise or frozen digits. Like I said, with hands so cold we couldn't hold our knives and the shakes of hypothermia setting in as we were pulling the guts out. Steam from the warmth of the body and guts rose from the elk and another idea hit my mind. I crawled right inside that elk's body cavity, and I'll be darned if it didn't warm me up quite a bit. When I crawled out, the shaking had stopped, and Ross went in to take his turn inside the warm corpse. To this day, I believe that idea, that saved our lives. No, I didn't get the idea from Han Solo in The Empire Strikes Back, but everyone always mentions that. Feeling slightly better and still not wanting to give up on our meat, it was time for the toboggan idea. We strapped our guns onto our packboards, both jumped on top of that giant elk, with each of us pulling back on an antler to keep the head from digging into the snow. The hair on an elk is pretty darn slippery against that snow, and as we pushed off from the top of the ridge into the slide chute, we were surprised on how fast we gained speed. I'd like to say it was an enjoyable and fun ride down, but it was not. The odd tree and rock lay in our way, and we managed to hit every single one, sending both Ross and I flying through the air, rolling down the mountain. As I climbed back up to the elk, I thought to myself, I must have wrecked the scope on my gun for sure. On top of this massive body, we would climb again, pulling back on the head and pushing off with one leg to get us started on our toboggan of death, plummeting down a near vertical snowslide. Thank God it was early in the season and we didn't cause an avalanche. We finally made it all the way to the bottom. From there, it was only about a half an hour skid to the road where we could walk back to the cabin and get the truck. Still lots of work to be done, as we had to chain up the truck to plow through all the snow and retrieve the elk back to the cabin. Now, you might have thoughts in your mind of a beautiful log house at the bottom of an alpine bowl. This was not that. It was the ugliest little old rustic cabin crammed into a patch of bush. 3 of the 4 walls you could see right through. But as was our style back in those days, a couple of shots of tequila made us feel warm, and we jumped in the truck and attempted to navigate up the unplowed road. We cranked the heater in that truck, and the warmth that came from those vents was worth $1 million in my mind. We made it back to that crappy little cabin just as it was getting dark, and luckily it had a wood stove and a good supply of firewood. That fire, and a few more nips of tequila, kept us warm until morning when we headed back to town, happy to be alive. In hindsight, we probably shouldn't have taken that shot, and luckily both of us made it down with our lives and all our fingers and toes. I thank God the outcome wasn't any different, and we had a great story to tell. All right, as promised, let me tell you a little bit more about the subject of today's story, Mr. Charles LaFortune. Chuck, as he's known to his friends, was born in 1953 in the East Kootenays of British Columbia, Canada, a small mining and now ski town of Kimberley. Chuck grew up to be an outdoorsman, hunter, miner, crew boss, rancher, trapper, home builder, and jack of all trades that no matter where he was or what he was doing, always had a love for and a calling from the great outdoors and wilderness. Chuck is the kind of guy that has been known to head into the mountains and hike where there's no trails and bringing little to no food. He'll end up high in the backcountry fleshing out a mule deer or a bighorn sheep, strapping it to his backboard and walking miles of rough and uncharted terrain to get back home. This guy is what I call a sucker for punishment. He loves being out there and pitting himself against nature. Hey, I love hunting too, but I'll never turn down a decent trail or the nice warm comfort of the cab of a truck. My hat's off to Chuck and others just like him. Strong outdoorsmen with a love for the wilderness and a desire to push their boundaries and their own limits. All right, now that's Chuck's story, but I'd like to tell yours. That's right, you've got an opportunity to send in your story to me and I'll tell it to the world. It's darn easy. You can either type it out and send it to info@themoosewhisperer.com or voice record it on your phone and share that file to info@themoosewhisperer.com. All right, folks, let's get those stories out there before it's too late. If you enjoyed this hunting story, thanks for sticking with me to the end. And don't forget to show your support with a like, subscribe, a comment, and for sure, give it a share. Let's support our hunters, our community. Thanks for watching. More stories to come.